It was a morning that looked like any other morning in London. The sky was pale gray, the kind of color that sits between night and day without choosing either. People were already moving through the streets below Kensington Palace, some rushing to work, some pushing prams, some stopping to check their phones. None of them knew that inside those tall, quiet walls something was shifting. Something had been shifting for a long time. Prince William stood near the window of his private study. He was not looking at anything in particular. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, the place people look when they are not really seeing at all, when the mind is somewhere else entirely. Turning something over and over, the way the sea turns a stone. He had not slept well. He rarely slept well anymore. There was always something pulling at him from the inside. Some quiet pressure that never fully went away. Catherine was down the corridor. She was dressed and ready, as she always was, long before the morning required it of her. That was the thing about Kate. She was always prepared. Even in moments of personal difficulty, she presented herself with a kind of careful steadiness that the world had come to rely upon. People called her poised. They called her graceful. What they did not always see was what that steadiness cost her, what it took every single day to be the woman the world needed her to be. Their children, George, Charlotte and Louis, were already in the care of their nanny that morning. The palace was quiet in that particular way that large buildings sometimes are, where the silence is not peaceful, but loaded, where every footstep down a corridor seems to carry more weight than it should. For months, two of them had been managing something that had no clean name. It was not a collapse. It was not a crisis in the dramatic sense that the tabloids would later try to make it. It was something quieter and in many ways harder. It was a growing distance between two people who had once been so close that the world had watched them with something close to wonder. There were still moments of warmth between them. Still moments when they laughed together, or when one would reach for the other's hand in a room full of people. But those moments had begun to feel like islands. And between the islands, there was a great deal of open water. William had entered royal life from birth. He had never known anything else. But Catherine had come into it as an adult, fully formed, with her own history and her own interior world. And the pressure that came with marrying into the most watched family on earth had been relentless. It did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly through the cameras at every turn, through the opinions published in newspapers about how she dressed, how she looked, how she spoke, whether she smiled too much or too little. Through the endless public engagements that required her to be warm and open even on the days when she felt neither of those things. Through the years of learning an entirely new set of rules, some written and some not. In a world where the unwritten ones were often the most punishing, and through all of it, Catherine had done what she always did. She had carried herself with composure. She had shown up. She had done the work. But there is a particular loneliness that comes with carrying things quietly, with being so visibly capable that the people around you forget to ask if you are all right. William knew this. He was not a man without feeling. He had grown up watching his mother struggle in the same machinery. He had carried his own grief, his own weight, for most of his life. He loved Catherine. That was never the question. The question was something more complicated, something that had to do with the space between two people who love each other, and the things that fill that space over time. The duties, the demands, the exhaustion, the years. There had been conversations, long and painful ones. The kind where both people are careful with their words because they know how much damage the wrong ones can do. Neither of them wanted to break what had been built for themselves, for their children, for the institution they both served. But caring about something deeply does not always mean you know how to protect it. Sometimes love alone is not enough to hold back the tide. What the world would later see was a series of images. A farewell at an airport. Two people standing close, but not touching. Faces that gave nothing away. It was not dramatic. There were no tears in front of cameras, no raised voices, no moment that anyone could point to and say that is when it happened. What the world saw was, in many ways, exactly what royal life had always trained them both to show. Control, dignity, composure, But behind that composure was a silence that was deafening to anyone paying close attention. The kind of silence that falls between two people who have said everything important already, get in private, and have nothing left to perform for each other. The kind of silence that follows a decision. They had made a decision. It had not come easily or quickly. It had come the way most difficult decisions come, slowly, painfully. After every other option had been examined and set aside, and as the morning moved forward and the light through the palace windows shifted from gray to pale gold, both William and Catherine prepared themselves for what was to come. Not the end of everything, but the end of something. And sometimes, an ending, even a necessary one, can break the hearts of millions of people who were watching, who had believed, who had needed the story to continue just as it was. The world did not know yet, but they would soon. And when they found out, nothing would feel quite the same. The news did not break the way people expected it to. There was no official statement at first, no carefully worded announcement released through royal communications. It began the way so many things begin in the modern world, with a photograph. A single image taken by a press photographer outside a private engagement that showed William and Catherine walking side by side but somehow unmistakably apart. It was in the angle of their bodies, in the careful distance between their arms, in the way neither of them turned toward the other as they walked. It was subtle enough that it could have been nothing. But for the millions of people who had followed this couple for more than a decade, who had watched them at their best, laughing at polo matches, kneeling beside sick children in hospital wards, dancing at Commonwealth events, it was enough. The internet moved quickly. It always does. By the time the photograph had been shared a few 100,000 times, the headlines had already started writing themselves. Royal watchers and commentators who had spent years studying the body language of the Windsor family weighed in within hours. Former palace staff gave careful, anonymous quotes. Old photographs were pulled out and compared. Timelines were constructed. The palace said nothing. And that silence, which was meant to protect, somehow made everything louder. Catherine had expected this. She had grown up, in a sense, inside the machinery of public attention. Not as a royal from birth, but as someone who had been photographed and written about since her early 20s. Since the world had decided that the young woman dating the future King of England was worth watching, she had spent years learning how to exist inside that attention without being consumed by it. But this was different. Because this time, what they were reporting or circling around cautiously, not yet ready to say it plainly, was true. She read nothing that day. That was a discipline she had developed over the years. On the days when the coverage was going to be difficult, she did not read it. She had learned that lesson the hard way early on, when a careless article had lodged itself inside her for weeks. The words people wrote about you, when they did not know you, could become a kind of poison if you let them in too freely. Instead, she focused on the children. George was old enough now to sense when something was different in the household. The adults around him were carrying something they were not sharing. He was a perceptive boy, quiet in the way that William had been quiet at his age, watching, absorbing, filing things away. Charlotte was her own force of nature, moving through the world with a confidence that sometimes startled people. Louis was still young enough to be fully inside his own universe of small joys and small complaints, unbothered by the larger weather of the family. Being with them was the only thing that made Catherine feel entirely herself that day. That clarity children give you of being needed in an immediate and uncomplicated way was something she had come to treasure more than almost anything else. William, across the city, was at a working engagement. He had not canceled it. That was the rule, the deep and unspoken code of royal life. You showed up. No matter what was happening inside you, no matter how heavy the thing you were carrying, you got into the car and you went. You shook the hands and you asked the questions and you listened and you smiled. And in some ways, he was grateful for it that day. The engagement gave him somewhere to put his attention, something external to focus on, a reason to be useful. But there were moments. Standing in a hospital corridor or listening to a briefing, when he felt the weight of what was happening settle on him fully. The image of their family, of what they had built together and what it had meant. Not just to them, but to so many people. sat somewhere in his chest and pressed. William was not a man who found it easy to talk about his internal world. That was something he had worked on for years in the wake of his mother's death, in therapy, in the slow and difficult work of learning to name things. But naming something and carrying it are two different tasks. That day the carrying was hard. Palisades had begun preparing the statement. It had been drafted and redrafted several times. Every word had to be precise, not cold, but not theatrical. Honest enough to satisfy the press, private enough to protect the children, dignified enough to honor what the relationship had been. These things are never easy to write. They are never easy to read, either. What the statement would eventually say was that the Prince and Princess of Wales had agreed, with great care and love for their family, to spend time apart while continuing to fulfill their royal duties and to co-parent their 3 children. It would describe their commitment to one another as a family as unwavering. It would ask for privacy during a difficult time. The words were accurate. They were also, inevitably, incomplete, because no statement of that length, no statement of any length, could hold the full weight of what had actually happened, could hold the years of effort and hope and adjustment and quiet sorrow, could hold the conversations in the dark that had gone in circles, could hold the love that had not disappeared but had changed shape in ways that made the original structure unlivable. When the statement was finally released, late in the afternoon, the world received it the way the world receives these things, with grief, with shock, with the strange intimacy of people mourning something that was never fully theirs to begin with. Social media filled with messages from ordinary people from every country, writing about watching the royal wedding as teenagers, about following the births of the children, about believing in something, that belief, that quiet investment in a story that had seemed to be about love surviving pressure. About 2 people choosing each other again and again was what made the silence of that farewell so heartbreaking, because it was not dramatic. It was not angry. It was just 2 people walking away from something real, with all the dignity they had left, and the world watched and felt something break. In the days that followed, the world did what it always does. When something it loves is taken away, it went searching for reasons. For the moment, the turning point, the crack in the foundation, commentators revisited every public appearance from the past 2 years, looking for signs they might have missed. Photographs were analyzed. Clips were slowed down. Experts in body language and relationship psychology appeared on television and radio, offering frameworks for what the public was feeling. But inside the palace, there were no cameras. There was just the quiet and the work of continuing. Catherine had moved with the children to Adelaide Cottage, the modest property on the Windsor estate where the family had chosen to live in recent years. It was smaller than most people imagined, deliberately so. Catherine had wanted the children to grow up in something that felt like a home rather than an institution. She had arranged the rooms herself, chosen colors and furniture that were warm and personal. It was a place where school bags were left by the door, and drawings were stuck to the fridge, and the garden was muddy more often than it was neat. She sat in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, the children already at school, a cup of tea going cold beside her. The house was very quiet. She was used to noise, to the particular, constant noise of 3 children moving through a home, and the silence felt different now than it used to. It felt larger. She was not someone who allowed herself to fall apart easily. That was not performance or suppression, it was simply the way she was built. She had always been steadier than people expected, more capable of sitting with difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. But steady and unaffected are not the same thing. And on mornings like this one, in the particular quiet of a house that had recently changed, she felt the full weight of everything. She thought about her own parents, about the home she had grown up in, warm, uncomplicated, full of the kind of ordinary happiness that is not glamorous, but is, in retrospect, everything. She had tried to build that for her own children. She still would. Whatever else changed, that commitment did not. There were logistics to manage. And in the early days after any significant change, logistics are almost a mercy. They give you something concrete to hold on to. Schools needed to be reassured. Schedules needed to be reorganized. Aides needed to be briefed. Public engagements were reviewed, some postponed. Others carefully maintained to signal to the world that both she and William were continuing. The work did not stop. In the royal world, the work never stops. William was at Kensington Palace, and then, for a stretch of days, at Anmer Hall in Norfolk, the country property that had always been a place of retreat for him. He had his staff around him, his protection team, the familiar rhythms of duty. But those rhythms, which had always provided structure, felt thin now. Like scaffolding around a building that wasn't there anymore. He called the children every evening. George and Louis talked about school with the easy randomness of boys' football results. A funny thing a teacher had said, a video game. Charlotte, in the way that Charlotte always had. Looked at her father carefully through the screen of the phone and asked him if he was all right. She was 8 years old. The directness of it almost undid him. "I'm all right, my darling," he told her. She looked at him a moment longer. "You don't look it," she said, and then moved on to telling him about the horse she had ridden that day. And he found himself laughing, really laughing. For the first time in what felt like a very long while, the public grief continued. In London, outside Kensington Palace, a small number of people had gathered each day since the statement. Not in protest, not in drama, but in the quiet way that people sometimes gather around things they cannot understand and cannot leave alone. Some left flowers. Some stood and looked at the gates as though answers might eventually appear. A woman from Manchester told a journalist that she had named her daughter Charlotte 5 years ago after Princess Charlotte because it had seemed like a symbol of something hopeful. She was not sure how to explain what that hope had meant to her. She held a bunch of yellow tulips and looked at the pavement and did not try. That story. The kind that surfaces after every large public event. The story of ordinary people and their ordinary grief was the one that said the most about what William and Catherine had meant. Not to the establishment, not to the institution of the monarchy, but to real people in real places who had watched them and found something in what they represented. The idea that love could hold. That two people could choose each other year after year inside impossible pressure and come through it. People needed that idea. Especially now, in a world that seemed to offer so few fixed things, where so much felt uncertain and exhausting. The story of William and Kate had been a story about endurance, about showing up, about choosing again and again, something real over something easier. And now that story had changed. And the grief was not irrational. It was the grief of losing a particular kind of hope. In Norfolk, one evening, William walked across the grounds of Anmer Hall alone. The light was the particular gold of a late afternoon in early spring. The trees at the edge of the property were beginning to show the first green of new leaves. He stopped walking and stood still for a while, looking at them. He thought about his mother. He thought about how much she had wanted a different kind of life than the one she had. He thought about how the institution had pressed on her, and how she had loved fiercely inside it, and suffered fiercely inside it, and never fully escaped it. He thought about the children. He was not going to be defined by this. Neither was Catherine. They were both stronger than what had happened to them. That was the one thing he held on to. But standing there, in the golden light, the grief was real. And he let it be real, because denying it would not make it smaller. His therapist had taught him that. His mother had taught him that too, in her own way, by showing him what happened when you tried to carry everything alone. When you never let anyone see the weight, he breathed the cold air and looked at the new leaves, and kept going. 3 weeks passed, then a month, and slowly, the way life always does, things began to find a new shape. Catherine appeared at a charity engagement in London, a children's literacy event she had long been committed to, and the coverage was enormous. Not because she did anything remarkable, but because the world had been holding its breath, waiting to see what she would look like, how she would carry herself. Whether the difficulty of the past weeks would show on her face. She wore a deep blue coat. Her hair was down. She crouched beside a 5-year-old girl who was holding a picture book. She talked to that child as though there was nothing else in the world that mattered. The photographs were everywhere within the hour. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People wrote about how composed she was, how strong, how present. Some called it inspiring. Some called it heartbreaking. The truth was that it was both, and that the line between the two had always been thinner than most people wanted to acknowledge. What Catherine felt that day was something she would not say out loud for a long time. Not publicly, and perhaps not even privately to many people. It was something like relief. Not at being separated, not at the difficulty that had led to where they were, but at being back in the work. At being useful again in the plain and direct way that charitable work allowed. The children she met at that event had no interest in her personal life. They wanted her to look at their drawings and listen to their stories. That simplicity was a gift. She had always found the work itself to be a grounding force. The causes she had invested in early childhood development, mental health, the lasting effects of childhood experience on adult life were not chosen at random. They came from a genuine conviction, deepened over years of engagement, that what happens to children in their earliest years shapes everything that comes after. She had thought about this in connection with her own children now more than ever. She was fiercely determined that what George, Charlotte, and Louis would carry from this period of their lives would not be damage, would not be confusion, but something more solid. The knowledge that both their parents loved them without qualification, that the shape of the family had changed, but not the love inside it. She and William had made that commitment together. Whatever else had become too heavy to carry, that one thing they both held firmly. The co-parenting arrangement was careful and considered. It was not without difficulty, nothing in this. The situation was without difficulty, but it was conducted with a respect for one another, and for the children that both of them honored. William had returned to London and resumed his full public schedule. He visited flood-damaged communities in the southwest of England. He attended a NATO briefing. He opened a mental health facility in Birmingham and sat with patients for longer than his schedule technically allowed. Because he had never been the kind of prince who sat with someone in pain and looked at the clock. Those who worked closely with him said he seemed focused, purposeful. The way people sometimes become after a long period of uncertainty lifts, not lighter exactly, but clearer. He and Catherine communicated regularly about the children, and on some occasions, about the work. There were engagements and causes that they had built together over years that still existed, still needed their attention. They had both decided, privately, that they would not allow what had happened between them to become a reason to abandon what they had built publicly. The charitable foundations would continue. The commitments would be honored. There was inevitably a conversation about whether they would ever appear publicly together again. Their communications teams had navigated this question with great care. The answer arrived at quietly, without drama, was yes, when it was appropriate, when the occasion called for it. The children's school events. Certain state occasions, moments where their presence together would serve a purpose larger than the spectacle it might create. Neither of them wanted to weaponize their separation. Neither of them wanted to give the public a performance of hostility that did not reflect what they actually felt for each other, which was not hatred, was not bitterness, but was something more complicated and more human than any headline could capture. King Charles, through all of this, had said very little publicly, but those close to him knew that he carried the weight of what had happened with a particular sorrow. He had seen enough loss inside this family, had lived through enough of his own history, to know that these things do not resolve neatly, that there is no clean ending to anything in a family like this one. He met with William privately, more than once. What they said to each other in those meetings was not shared. But people who saw William after those conversations said that he carried himself with a little more ease, that whatever his father had given him in words, in steadiness, in the simple fact of being there, it had helped. Queen Camilla, who had navigated her own complicated place in public opinion for more than 2 decades, reached out to Catherine. That, too, was a private thing. A phone call, a quiet acknowledgement from one woman to another of what it meant to live inside this particular world. To be loved inside it and pressed by it simultaneously. Catherine received it with gratitude. It was not a moment she spoke about, but it stayed with her. The world outside continued its analysis. There were opinion pieces that blamed one and excused the other. There were pieces that blamed the institution. There were pieces that were kind and pieces that were cruel, as there always are. The social media reaction ranged from enormous compassion to the uglier things that social media sometimes produces: speculation, judgment. The strange aggression of strangers who have decided they know exactly what happened in a life they have never come close to. Catherine and William both understood by now. The way you understand something you have lived with for years, that the public narrative about their lives was a separate thing from their lives. It overlapped with reality in places and diverged from it in others. And the only way to survive the divergence was to hold firmly to what you actually knew to be true. What they knew to be true was this: they had loved each other. They had built something real and good together. They had 3 children who were extraordinary. They had done important work in the world. And the fact that this chapter had ended did not erase what had come before it. That was not nothing. In fact, depending on the day, it felt like everything. Spring arrived the way it always does in England, not all at once, but in small and persistent installments. A warmer afternoon here, a longer evening there, flowers appearing in the parks without announcement, as though they had simply decided that enough time had passed. George, Charlotte, and Louis went back to school after the Easter break, with full lunch boxes and muddy trainers, and the kind of resilience that children have when they are loved well. Not an absence of feeling, but an ability to keep moving through it. Their parents had worked hard to give them that. Both William and Catherine had spoken to the children carefully and honestly, in appropriate ways, about what had changed and what had not changed. What had not changed was the part that mattered most to them. The part that any child needs to hear in the clearest possible terms. You are loved. Both of us love you. That does not end. That does not bend. Whatever else shifts around you, that is fixed. Charlotte had taken to sitting with Catherine in the evenings before bed and talking, not always about anything in particular, but in the comfortable, wandering way of a child who wants the company of her mother more than she wants a specific conversation. She asked questions sometimes that were hard. Children always do. She asked once whether her parents had stopped being friends. Catherine had thought about that for a moment. No, she said. We're still friends. It's just a different kind of friendship now. Charlotte had looked at her with those serious eyes and seemed to decide that this was acceptable. She had nodded, pulled her duvet up, and asked her mother to stay until she fell asleep. Catherine had sat in the small chair beside the bed and stayed. Long after Charlotte's breathing slowed, looking at her daughter's face in the soft lamplight, thinking about everything, feeling it all at once, William had a moment of his own, a few weeks into the new arrangement at a polo match that George had attended with him. It was a casual, private event, the kind that did not bring cameras or public attention. Just grass and horses and the smell of a summer that had not quite arrived yet. George had watched the horses with an intensity that reminded William of himself at that age, the way he used to focus on things that gave him joy, fully, without reservation. At some point, George had turned to him and said, without preamble, "Dad, are you happy?" William had not expected the question. He had looked at his son, this boy who was growing up too fast, who was already showing the careful watchfulness of someone who understood, on some level, what his life would one day require of him, and he had answered honestly. "I'm getting there," he said. George had nodded, satisfied by the honesty, if not by the answer, and turned back to the horses. Getting there. It was a modest thing to say, but it was true. And in truth, both William and Catherine were discovering that the path through something this large and this public was not a straight line. It doubled back sometimes. It had good weeks and hard ones. It had days where everything felt manageable, and days where the loss of what had been made the air feel heavier. That was not failure. It was just grief, doing what grief does, moving through a person on its own schedule, showing up unexpectedly, refusing to be hurried. What helped, for Catherine, was the work. It always came back to the work. In the weeks that followed the public statement, she had thrown herself into the causes she cared most about with a renewed kind of energy. The early years program she had spent years developing, the mental health initiatives she and William had co-founded, and that she now carried forward in her own name. She testified before a parliamentary committee on child development. She visited a school in Leeds where a program she had helped fund had transformed reading outcomes for hundreds of children. She sat on the floor of a classroom and read aloud, and the children climbed into her lap and pulled her hair and showed her their drawings. And she laughed with a fullness that was entirely genuine. What helped William, increasingly, was allowing himself to be helped. That had always been harder for him than for most. He had come of age inside a family where strength was displayed and vulnerability was managed, where the idea of asking for support was something that needed to be learned rather than inherited. But he had been learning it for years now, slowly and imperfectly. And in this period of his life, he leaned on that learning more than he ever had. He continued his therapy. He talked to his closest friends, a small, fiercely loyal group who had known him long enough to see through the exterior he presented to the world. He called Harry once. That call, long and difficult and not without its own history, nonetheless gave him something he had not expected. The particular comfort of speaking to someone who understood from the inside what this family cost, the people within it. There came a day in early June when William and Catherine appeared together. For the first time since the statement had been released, it was at a school sports day, not a state occasion, not a formal engagement, but something ordinary and irreducibly human. They arrived separately. They sat near each other. When Lewis ran his race and fell over and got up and kept running, they both stood at the same moment, both laughing, both proud in exactly the same way. In a gesture so instinctive and so synchronized that the few photographs taken that day captured it, with an honesty that no composed public appearance ever could, they did not touch. They were careful with each other in the way that people are when they have agreed to be decent, or holding to that agreement consciously. But there was nothing cold in it. There was nothing performed. They were two people who had loved each other, who had built 3 children together, who had stood in front of the whole world and promised things to each other that had not survived intact, but who were, nonetheless, going to honor what remained, the image of them standing together at that sports day, both laughing at their youngest son, spread across the world in hours. People wrote about it in the way they write about small things that somehow carry enormous meaning. A journalist who had covered the royal family for 20 years wrote that it was the most human photograph she had ever seen of them, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't try to hide. That was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about all of it, about the silence of that farewell and everything that came after. It did not hide. Neither of them hid. They had walked away from something in front of the entire world, without drama, without cruelty, with a quietness that had broken millions of hearts. And then they had kept going, kept showing up, kept being parents and people and public figures in a world that was watching every single step. The story had not ended. Stories like this never really end. They continue in school pickups, and evening phone calls, and shared glances at sports days. They continue in children who are loved, and in work that matters, and in the slow, private work of 2 people who had once been everything to each other, learning to be something new. It was not what anyone had hoped for, but it was real. And sometimes real is the most you can ask for. The world watched, and in watching, understood something about love, not the kind that lasts forever in the way of fairy tales, but the kind that endures, that transforms, that holds even when the shape of it changes beyond recognition. That understanding, quiet and aching, was the final gift of the silence.